Hi, everyone. In this episode, we delve into chilling accounts of creatures so bizarre and elusive that they will challenge your understanding of the natural world. Bundle up as we hear the chilling details, examine the evidence, and attempt to unravel the truth behind these enigmatic creatures. So, if you're in it to win it, please squash that subscribe button and let's get into the stories. Sometime back in October, I was on a road trip with some friends, and we were traveling through Wisconsin. We are all from Michigan, but we're on a trip to visit all of the Great Lakes. And at that point, the only one we had left was Lake Superior. On our way there, we were also visiting some of the nearby nature, reserves, parks, and forests along the way so that we could also hike and camp. We had this planned out for months. I think we started planning it at the beginning of that year, but we had been discussing it for years before then. So anyway, this was something we were super excited about. We also planned on visiting some of the more local attractions like museums and such. Sometimes we'd ask locals for recommendations or advice for our travels. Well, one night my friends and I are out walking around one of the towns and we meet an old man. We got to talking to him and told him about our plans and where we were headed. He then proceeded to tell us about how he did something similar with his friends when he was our age and that he wishes us the best, and for us to stay safe. But then when we mentioned we were going to hang out at Lake Superior and possibly camp there for a few days, he got all weird. He kind of became aggressive and strongly advised against staying in the area past dark. His face became pale and his hands became shaky. "There's something evil that lives up in those parts," he said. "You'd best not be out past dark when you're there." He would not elaborate when we asked more, and he also began to slur and mutter a bunch of gibberish, so my friends and I assumed he was just crazy. We told him thank you for the advice and politely got ourselves away from the situation. At the end of that night, we were driving to our hotel, and this is when the weird things began to happen. The road was dark. We were the only car there at that point, and it was a little foggy. Visibility was low. As we are driving, the ride is silent because we were all tired. Well, out of nowhere, the driver curses, hits the brakes, and swerves hard to the left. There is a thud, and we see a shadowy figure collapse to the ground. Scared, we all stumbled out of the car, but there was nothing there. The hood of the car is dented, as though we had hit something, and there was a little tuft of fur stuck to it too. Then there was this smell of rotten meat that just hovered over us. We looked for a while but found nothing, and eventually we convinced ourselves we must have hit a deer that jumped off the side of the road. So we got back in the car and continued driving. A few days later, we had pretty much forgotten about the past weirdness, and we made it up to Lake Superior. We were staying at the Knife River campground. After we pitched our tents, we went down to the Knife River Marina Beach. We spent the day swimming and hanging out. It was a lot of fun. Then nighttime came along, and we spent time around a bonfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. I have no idea what time it was when this happened, but I know it was pretty late. One of our friends decided they had to go to the restroom and waddled off into the bushes to do their business. The rest of us continued our conversations until a few minutes later, when our friend came sprinting back to the campground. She was pale and shaky and very freaked out about something. We tried to calm her down, but she became more hysterical, telling us to put out the fire and get in the vehicle. She was now screaming that there was a monster in the woods. Just then, this thick smell of rotten meat filled the air like cheap cologne, and along with it we heard a low, growling noise coming from behind the trees. Our friend screams and tries to drag us away, but we just stare at the spot where the noise is coming from. At this point, we were hoping it might just been a stray dog. At least that's the thought that was going through my brain. But then, from behind a dense cluster of towering trees, there slowly emerged a creature that can only be described as a gigantic monster. And I choose that word with extreme care and deliberation. Standing easily 7 or 8 feet tall, it was an awe-inspiring sight that left me completely confused. Its overall appearance was eerily reminiscent of a werewolf, and yet there it was, right in front of my very eyes, Upon closer observation, the monster was standing on two legs similar to a human. Its legs were thick and supporting an upper body that was unnaturally muscular, almost as if it had been carved with the perfection and precision of a sculpted bodybuilder. Covered in a dense layer of gray fur, the creature's skin underneath seemed to ripple with sheer power. Its long snout, filled with rows of sharp, gleaming teeth, protruded menacingly, adding to the terror of its appearance. The face of the creature was uniquely horrifying, bearing a strong resemblance to a demonic German shepherd. Its ears were pointed and alert, and the teeth, already mentioned, were sharp and seemed capable of tearing through anything. But what was most unsettling were its eyes. They were dark, blank, and empty, void of any discernible emotion or intelligence, and yet somehow seemed to pull you in. And then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time itself, I swear to God, the corners of this beast's lips curled upwards, and it smiled at us. It did this with a smile that was both fascinating and utterly terrifying. We began to scream and push each other and tried to run away, but we just kind of stumbled around. Then it hit me. This was the same smell the night we hit something with the car. I felt my heart stop when I realized this. The creature howled, and that broke us from our trance. We ran as fast as we could to the vehicle and got out of there. We had no idea where we were going. We just drove until we could no longer see it, chasing us in the rearview mirror. The next day, we all discussed what we had seen and had no idea what to think. We had all seen and smelt that monster. There was no way it wasn't real, but at the same time, I do not believe in the supernatural or werewolves or anything like that. None of us did. We cut our trip short and began our journey home that morning. At some point, we had to stop to get gas, and we bumped into that old man we had seen at the bar nearly a week ago at this point. Trying to be slick, we asked him if he had ever seen anything strange up at the lake, and he paled in response. "You've seen it too?" he asked quietly. Scared and shocked, I nodded in response. "Then count yourself lucky to be alive," he said gravely. "We haven't been back to Wisconsin since." I'm a retired school teacher in Illinois, and I've been a camp host since 2016. It's a relaxing job for someone who loves the outdoors. It doesn't pay much, but you can set up your camper in a picturesque location and camp for free all summer, so that really was the appeal for me. I'm there for all the campers who have problems, and to be honest, that hardly ever happens. Most weeks go by with me only talking to one or two of the campers occupying the sites, just chit-chat, and I also make the rounds every night at dusk to sell firewood out of my pickup truck. I had talked to the young couple in Campsite 7 when they first arrived, and we had a nice chat. They were in their mid-20s and planned to do some hiking in the area. They had a little white dog with them, a mixed breed, I think, and they said it loved to camp. I was a little concerned one day when I didn't see the couple as I made my rounds in the evening. I took a peek again at 11:30 p.m., and they still weren't back. They told me they were staying for a week, and their tent was still up, and their car was there. People have to register if they plan to backcountry camp, and they hadn't registered to do that, nor had they mentioned any plans of that sort. At first, I thought maybe they had some friends in the area that had picked them up and were staying over in town for a night. But when the second night came and they still weren't back, I began to get worried. Now, I'm not a babysitter. People can come and go as they please, and at the time I thought it was possible that I just kept missing them. After all, I couldn't see their site from my camp host site. But the next morning after that second night, I went to clean the restrooms and I drove by their campsite. Alarm bells immediately went off. Their little dog was there, sniffing all over the ground, and their tent had blown down. I walked over and the dog trotted up and licked my hand, whining. He seemed so grateful to see someone. I called hello a few times, but I could tell his owners weren't in the area, so I scooped the little fellow back up and brought him back to my site to give him some food. Poor thing gobbled up a hamburger like he was starving. His coat was all dirty with twigs caught in it, and he was trembling, so I decided to call my supervisor. I reported the couple as potentially lost in the woods, and the authorities sent out a small search party. I volunteered to take care of the pup while we waited. I really felt bad for the little guy. It took almost a whole day, but I was greatly relieved when a truck rolled in with the young couple in the passenger seat. They were dirty and scratched up, and the volunteer that brought them in took me aside and said he thought they were suffering from hallucinations. He had already radioed in that they'd been found, so I knew there would be paperwork to fill out. I lent them a couple of blankets to wrap up in and made some coffee. The woman was so happy to see her dog she burst into tears. Then they told me what had happened. The man said they'd been hiking along the ridge and their dog started barking at something behind them. He said they were afraid it was a bear since they both were carrying food in their backpacks. You're not supposed to do that, by the way. They scooped up the dog and made a lot of noise, clapping their hands and talking loud, trying to scare it off, but then the woman spotted it. She said it absolutely was not a bear. She told her husband it looked like a gorilla, but it was smart, hiding behind the trees whenever they stopped. She was really shaken up, so he told me most of the story himself. The fellow said at first he didn't believe her. He thought her mind was playing tricks on her, but then the creature got bolder and came out in the open. He told me it had to be 7 feet tall and it had massive arms and legs, standing on 2 legs and covered in fur, all except for its face. I looked the young man in the eye as he told me this, and it was plain he believed what he was saying. I've had my share of lies told to me, being a school teacher for 27 years, but this fellow wasn't lying. He said he believed this creature was the Bigfoot. He told me it started acting aggressive, stalking them, and they had no choice but to run. The poor woman started crying as her husband told me the next part. They were so scared of the creature that when the little dog slipped out of her grasp, he grabbed her arm and wouldn't let her stop running. It was going to attack us, he said. I felt bad, but we had to get away. They wound up hiding in one of the caves up on the ridge. He said once they got to higher ground, they started throwing rocks at it and kicking logs and debris down the side of the mountain, trying to make a rock slide so it couldn't reach them. It stayed down below, making these horrible screeches of anger, he said, all through the night while they stayed up in higher elevation, trying to find shelter and stockpiling rocks and fallen limbs for ammunition. The next morning, they didn't see it and tried to find their way back, but they'd gotten so turned around when they were running that they found themselves hopelessly lost. They spent their second night up in a tree, he said, using straps on their backpacks to loop over limbs so they wouldn't fall. They were both dirty and covered in scratches, and it was not a stretch to believe they had been fighting to survive. But then the forest rangers showed up. They listened rather skeptically and suggested it was a bear. The couple disagreed and the rangers became irritated, really tearing down their story. The man finally lost his cool and said he didn't care what they thought. It wasn't a bear, and he was going to go to the local news and report what he'd seen. That's when things got ominous. One of the many vehicles that had rolled back in with the search teams was a black SUV. No one had emerged from the vehicle until that moment. It sounds crazy, but I wonder if they had a listening device in the vehicle, because once the young man started getting irate, this fellow got out. He came up to the couple and said something in a low tone that I couldn't hear and flashed some ID. Next thing I know, he escorts them over to the SUV and they all got in and drove away. I asked the ranger who that was, and he looked around like he was afraid to be caught telling and mumbled Homeland Security. I don't know what to think of that. I never saw the couple again. I got up the next morning and their campsite was cleared out. I caught the story on the local news, and it said the missing couple had been found by the search team, unhurt. All the story said was they had gotten lost in the forest. So I guess that young man never got to tell the local news what he saw after all. There's a bridge in San Antonio that you can't cross. There's probably more than one, but this particular bridge crosses the Medina River. It's somewhat out of the way, and unless you were in a situation like mine, I doubt you'd ever come across the bridge naturally. You see, I like to fish in my spare time. Catfish, bass, and whatever else white from the bottom of a riverbed. I'm always looking for a new place to cast. There aren't many qualifications. Water, a place to sit, and a bit of peace and quiet. If you're a river in Texas and your bend can check those boxes, odds are that we've met before. I've been up and down the Medina. This spot was northeast of where Palo Alto crosses the Anderson Loop. I thought it would be a good spot. My dog Bear agreed. I always brought Bear out with me. He likes the mud and the trees and the wet wind that kicks up from the river. He was always my lookout. I didn't always fish in places I was welcome, if you catch my drift. What was I supposed to do after I ran out of legal places to cast my line? Listening to your channel, I know I'm not the only one who's brought his dog to face the great unknown. Something about them just makes us feel safe, doesn't it? Untouchable. Bear and I found a secluded spot underneath the shade the bald cypress trees that line the river. He found a place to dig, and I found a branch that would perfectly support the weight of my fishing pole. It was mid-afternoon at the time. The day was cool and the water was clear. Bear and I found enough of heaven in that spot to get us through the day. After about 2 hours, things took a turn. The fish weren't biting much, so when Bear got antsy, I noticed. He started to whine. I managed to settle him down a few times, but it wasn't long before the dog was nudging me with his snout. He must have smelled something. There wasn't anything around us to see just yet. His nudging eventually got the best of me. I figured he was bored with our spot, and I stood to pack up our belongings. Water bowl, tackle box, fishing pole, and the leftovers we brought from home. Before I could finish, Bear started to growl. I don't want to assume your stance on dog breeds. I'm going to ask you to trust me when I say that Bear wasn't the type to growl. I'd only heard him bark once or twice before that day. When he started gnashing his teeth and yapping at the trees further down the river, I knew something was incredibly wrong. I tried to call the dog and bring him to heel, but Bear wasn't listening. Whatever he was fixated on, it was more important than my voice in his ears or my hand on his back. I think he was scared. He bolted toward the sight or the scent that only he had noticed. What choice did I have except to pursue? Water bowl, tackle box, fishing pole. They all ended up back in the mud. They were torn out of my hands by the foliage as I tried to catch up to Old Bear. I could still see the hind legs of my dog, ducking under the brush and leaping over the muck that lined the riverside. He was a familiar flash of black and brown. What wasn't familiar was the shape that he was chasing. It was about the size of a person, but it ran too low to the ground. Tan fur kicked out from behind it as it ran, flapping like a blanket or a big coat made of buckskin. If it was a person, it moved faster and weirder than any man that I'd ever seen. I called Bear again. This time the bridge I described had come into view. All stone and metal, very modern but very abandoned. Fenced off so nobody could touch it. Bear stopped. The thing he had been chasing squatted under the bridge. It was facing us by that point, defending its territory, I guess. What I saw didn't make any sense. I thought there were human limbs under all that fur. In the very least, the arms and legs bent just like a man's would. The head was all wrong, though. It was long and stretched. The eyes were bulbous and too far apart. It almost looked like a horse's head, except for the absence of fur. Its face was naked, peachy tan and scabbed from flies in the sun. The creature peeled back its lips to reveal a wide row of human teeth. It snarled and then it howled. Or maybe it was a neigh. It's hard to say. The call was long and erratic, like a laugh or a sob. Bear folded back his ears and his tail fell between his legs. We ran out of there together, sprinting as fast as we could. I tripped and earned a face full of mud on the way out. We left everything behind. I could replace all of those items. I couldn't replace myself or my dog if that creature came barreling down upon us. We hiked back to where we left our car and found even more cause for concern. The metal body of my SUV was dented, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my doors. Around the outside of the vehicle, what looked like hoof prints were pressed upon the ground. Lilith, I've never heard of anything like what I saw. I'd like to learn more about it, but I don't even know what to search for. Was it a witch? Was it a daydream? If you or any of your followers have heard of the thing haunting Medina River, I need you to let me know. I'm never going back there, but even a little peace of mind would go a long way. I've always been a loner. It's probably mostly out of habit. I had a lot of illnesses as a kid, so I never really got to have a normal childhood with friends and stuff. Instead, I spent a lot of time in a hospital bed and a lot more time dreaming about being part of a group, like the characters from my favorite TV shows. I started getting better as I got older. By my late teens, I barely had any major hospital stays. But I was still homeschooled because my parents and doctors didn't want to put too much stress on my immune system right away. Maybe that's why I really wanted to go to college. Not just online, I wanted the whole experience. Dorm rooms, cafeteria food, walking to class, all of it. I guess I wanted to make up for lost time. When I first started, I was really nervous. I didn't really know how to interact with people who weren't wearing scrubs except for what I'd learned from watching TV. Turns out, I didn't have to worry so much. I met a super nice group: James, Rachel, Sarah, and Eric. We shared some interests, and they were really cool despite my awkwardness. I really wanted to make a good impression on them so that I could become an official member of the friend group. I was hoping for an opportunity to do some sort of group activity so I could bond with everyone. I got my chance when they invited me on a camping trip. We would all carpool to the campsite, which wasn't too far away. Then we would spend a long weekend hanging out and sleeping under the stars. When we got to the campsite, they taught me how to set up the tents and cook camping food. We roasted marshmallows and sang campfire songs and stargazed and told scary stories. It was just like on TV, only better because it was real. Unfortunately, not all the evening was great. There were other groups camping in the sites around us, and one of them was really rude. I don't know what school they went to, but they were college kids like us. They partied very loudly through half of the night. James went over to talk to them, then Sarah. It wasn't just us either. A few of the other groups camping in the area tried to talk to them. They wouldn't listen. It wasn't a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but we were all annoyed that they were being so inconsiderate. So, we decided to teach them a little lesson. When we were telling scary stories the first night, we found out that Eric could do some disturbingly convincing, creepy monster noises. We decided to use that to freak out the rude campers by making them think there was a real monster. Eric went into the car so nobody nearby would hear and recorded several audio clips of various monster noises. He connected his phone to Sarah's Bluetooth speaker, which we then hid near the other campsite. Then we found a hiding place further away where we could see the results of our prank without them seeing us. Eric started playing the clips, and it was so funny. He started with a low growl noise. The rude campers were playing music, and they stopped and turned it down so they could hear better. Then Eric pressed play again, and they looked at each other all nervous. We all had to bite our hands to keep quiet. We could hear the rude campers asking each other if they heard a sound. Eric kept them on edge with some ominous hissing and growling sounds for a couple minutes. Finally, Rachel grabbed the phone, turned the volume way up, and blasted them with a screeching roar. They all went ballistic. Everyone ran around screaming, grabbing their stuff, and running into their trailer. My friends and I were all laughing so hard as we ran away. We were walking along this kind of hill area where the ground sort of dropped off with a moderate slope. At the bottom of the hill, it got flat again and the trees resumed. From where we were, we could see out over the lower area and into the trees. There was a denser patch of trees between us and the rude campers, so we felt comfortable having our flashlights on. We were all whispering and giggling about the prank we just pulled, and we were generally in very high spirits. But then James made a gesture which made his flashlight beam shine into the forest at the base of the slope. I just remember a flash of red eyes and a large, dark shape. We all froze, except Eric. I guess he was more adventurous, or maybe he just didn't believe he'd seen what he'd seen. He slowly moved his light back to where we saw the shape. I'd be willing to bet that everyone else was thinking exactly what I was thinking, that Eric had just gotten all of us killed, because there was something there. In the dim light, I saw a dark and enormous figure that certainly didn't look like anything human. Its body was bulky and unusual. Its shoulders were way too wide, and they looked distorted and abnormal, as if something was not right with them. Instead of a head like you would expect on a person, it just seemed to have a lumpy mass sitting on top of those massive shoulders. The most striking feature was its eyes, which were enormous and glowing with a deep, sinister red color. Neither my friends nor I moved, frozen in shock and curiosity. The creature didn't move either. It just stared directly at us, its eyes fixed on us like lasers. The air was heavy with tension, and we could hear our own breathing, shallow and fast. We were all holding our breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Suddenly, something unbelievable occurred. A part of what I had assumed were its distorted shoulders began to extend outward. What looked like misshapen shoulders were actually wings, and they were enormous. These wings were far larger than those of even the largest bird I had ever seen. They stretched out, fully extended, and we realized that they weren't just for display. The creature then crouched down, gathering its strength. We watched, our eyes wide with fear and fascination as it prepared to take off. Without warning, it shot straight up into the air, moving with incredible speed and force. It was as if it had been launched from a cannon, and it soared higher and higher until it became just a speck in the sky. We all looked up, but somehow it had already completely disappeared into the night sky. I don't think any of us slept the rest of that night. I don't know about the others, but I was waiting for the thing from the forest to come back. I didn't know what I thought it would do, but I didn't want to find out. But whatever it was, it never came back. As soon as it was light, we packed up and went back to school, and we all agreed never to talk about what had happened again. I had hoped that my first camping trip with my new friends would be an experience to remember, but I hadn't counted on living through a real-life episode of Scooby-Doo. Maybe the hospital was safer after all. Back in 1994, I saw something that I'll never forget. It was pretty late at night, around 2 to 3 a.m., and I was working on scraping all the snow off my car window since my job required me to get up early and leave early. It was at least an hour commute, and I had to be there by 4:30 sharp. And in this point in time, I was in easily the worst shape of my life. This was long before I got myself into shape, and at the time I was drinking copious amounts of coffee, energy drinks, and anything I could just to function during the day. I was getting terrible sleep too, probably due to my diet. I mention this because I tried to rationalize if I hallucinated what happened. Anyway, after getting all the snow off my car, I got in and started heading to work when I saw the strangest animal of my life approaching my vehicle from the front, and my mind began racing as I realized just how large this thing was. And then it did something more terrifying than you could ever imagine. It, whatever this thing was, stood up on 2 legs and crossed the road right up to my vehicle, crouched down on one knee, and looked directly at me through the front window. It had dark, reddish-brown fur covering its entire body. I'll never forget how scared I was. It was even taller, standing up on 2 legs than the very top of my car, and it stood very comfortably like that, just like a man would. The face was what really stuck out to me and what really gave it away as something not of this world. It looked like a cross between a wolf and a monkey's face with a pronounced brow, large jawbones, and a mouth full of long, sharp teeth. It also had a shorter, more condensed muzzle. It also had human-like characteristics to its face, more around the corners of its mouth and its eyes, like it could make a proper expression. Frozen and terrified and not sure what I should do, I slammed the car into drive, putting my foot all the way down on the gas pedal as if I had a lead foot. I flew forward, and this thing dove out of the way just in time to avoid being hit, even though it's not like me hitting it with my tiny car would have done anything to hurt it. My car would have been the one to take the damage from whatever this thing was. But when it leaped out of the way, it was lightning fast. Inhumanly possible. Like, in the blink of an eye, it was just gone out of the way, and I drove and sped off onto the road leading away from my house. I flew out of there much faster than I should have. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't lose control and wreck. It was considerably cold that morning, and there was lots of ice and moisture on the road. I could have easily flown off the road and hit a tree, but at the time of it all happening, I didn't care. In fact, I wasn't even really thinking, just reacting. Anything to get me away from whatever that creature was. And that's it. That's the end of my encounter. But every morning, I still wonder if I'm going to see it again.